Welcome to another Eternal Unleashed Flash Draft. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you're enjoying the content, and let's get right in it. So pack 1, Rocky Ride, which is okay removal, but not even anything crazy. I tend to legendary draft if possible, so we end up taking the mass production. This card is not really made for limited, so it'll probably not make the deck. Pack 2 here, all the uncommons, not very interesting. Out of the commons, mediocre ones, we have an Arcanum Orb here, Rebel Sharpshooter, and Nevermore, which are all fine playables, but we got a Grumbos platoon here. You guys know how much these Time Unleash units have been overperforming. Now, I couldn't believe this. Third pick Insect Swarm with the rare and the uncommon missing. There are definitely rares that you would take over Insect Swarm, but I'm not even sure which uncommon you could take over it. I'm sure there's some, but this common just always overperforms, so easy Insect Swarm here. This pack, just a bunch of mediocre commons. I lean towards Covenant Peacekeeper only because it's been overperforming for me, but you could have honestly picked any of these three and have been happy. This pack, we actually have a really strong uncommon in the Hidden Garret, if I'm even saying that correctly. It's just really strong removal. It is double shadow influence, so you have to keep that in mind. So we pick up the Relic Weapon here. The next pack, we're starting to see some signals that Justice could be open, but we have a strong dual faction uncommon that goes with our strong shadow removal. So we pick up a pretty easy Shadowlands Bone Picker here. The only interesting cards here really are the Forlorn Griffin, power level wise, but the Towering Terrazon is a solid beefy unit, and we want to make sure we stay time so we can play the platoon and the Insect Swarm. So we pick up the Towering Terrazon here. We're getting later in the pack now, so we aren't expecting to find anything too crazy. Since we're leaning towards Xenon here, we take up the Consuming Greed here. Nothing really here. The Shadow and Time cards aren't great, and Thunder Pop is clearly the strongest card out of these. It's our pickup just in case we end up Primal. Here, just a bunch of nonsense fire cards. We end up with Point Blank. We get a Grizzled Hermit pretty late, and then we pick up a Rifle. So this is an interesting pack here. We do have the one Thunder Pop, so part of me was looking at the Borderlands Waykeeper, which is a really strong uncommon primal unit, but I would rather focus on making sure we're heavier one faction, and since we have the majority of our strength in our Time faction, we end up going with Grumbos platoon here. Now this was a tough pack. We're starting to see some mixed signals. At first we're seeing some Shadow, then potentially some Justice. Here we have Honored Skyguard, which is a really strong primal rare. Unfortunately it's double primal influence, so it's not easy to splash, but definitely the strongest card in the pack. There's also a Questioning Devotee, which is really strong in the Unleashed Time deck. This was a tough one I went back and forth on. We ended up landing on the Honored Skyguard though, just for power level's sake, and we do have the Thunder Pop. A few strong cards in this pack, but easy Tenured Graviturgist. Putting back an Insect Swarm and giving it +1/+1 is almost always game if you get to do that line of play. So this pack had a few different decision points. The Zoltan Eldermark is the only time card we could consider picking here, but it's really not a great one. Seek Power was one of my other thoughts, since we're still kind of waffling back and forth between Shadow and Primal. We, however, go with the Scaly Dinosaur. It's actually been performing okay for me, holding down the ground while I finish off my opponent in the air. Once again, this is another rough pack for us. We just picked a Primal card, 2 Primal cards. We don't see any Primal in this pack, and the Time cards aren't great. I do, looking back on this, think we should have went with Resettle. Given how you guys will see the draft ends up, I think if you have enough Unleash units, Resettle actually becomes a really strong engine for your deck. but we end up going with a Starving Horror, which is just a mediocre shadow unit. You're going to start noticing a theme here, how these packs are sending us very weird signals. We have a couple really decent Justice cards in here. Pull Up is a solid combat trick, and Core Repairman has actually been a really good unit for us. And the Time, Shadow, and Primal cards are all garbage in this pack, so we end up going with Pull Up. Another rough pack, no Primal cards we're interested in playing. We have a mediocre Shadow unit, and there's a Covenant Peacekeeper if we end up starting to go the Justice route, which potentially seemed like it could be open. We end up going with the Zoltan Eldermark, even though it's not a great card. Another tough decision here. We end up going with a Reverberating Strike here. I think it has its place in the format. We still were waffling between Shadow, Justice, and Primal as the secondary colors. We really didn't want to pick up the Copperhall Recruit, so you kind of see how these packs have just been really brutal for us to find our second faction. Another mediocre pick of cards here. We end up going with a Smog Monster. So here, we end up going with Pin the Jotun, as it is okay removal. Ideally, I prefer Midnight Tinker over Hamlet Axe, but since we keep waffling back and forth, we need to make sure we have enough playables at the end of the draft. So we actually end up picking the Hamlet Axe, even though it's a pretty weak weapon. And then just a Decay here, nothing interesting. Oh man, this pack I went deep on. Now the things I was looking at here, Open Your Eyes is a really solid dual faction card, but we also have Inseparable and Cabal Embezzler. That in and of itself is a hard decision for me. I'm much higher on Inseparable than most people. It's almost always backbreaking in a game to get back two of your best units. So this was kind of the decision where, do we end up going Xenon or do we end up going LC? We end up going with Inseparable, leaning more towards Xenon since we weren't seeing the most Primal cards. Now you see we're almost instantly punished by not taking the Primal dual faction card. We do have the Uncountable, which has been very strong for me, especially with all the Unleash units that you can discard or sacrifice with its effect. The Teriox mount's also in here, which would have been a great addition if we went the Elcian route, especially giving something like Grumbo's Platoon +1/+1 flying and then bouncing that back to your hand. And then you're just playing 2-cost 3/2 flyers over and over again. We end up going with Call the Hit here. We kind of just need to start picking a direction, and we've wasted too many picks on factions that we aren't actually going to be playing. There's a Pull from Duty in the pack. This is probably the most busted card to have with Unleash units. You bounce back that Insect Swarm with a +2/+2 buff and the Invoke, and then you're playing 2-cost 3/3 flyers over and over again. The easiest slam dunk Pull from Duty ever. We'll figure out the influence requirements later. This pack, pretty easy Toxic Wisp here. It's the strongest card in the pack. It's Shadow. Easy pickup here. Glad to see it. This was an interesting pick. I was debating between Lotus Instructor, Unseen Marksman, which we could also splash if we're splashing Pull from Duty, but I'd really rather make sure we can play the Pull from Duty consistently, so we pick up the Ruin Sword. The Inscribe cards are amazing ways of splashing because they're either the Sigil when you need that influence, or when you already drew the influence you needed, it's then just a free spell in your deck. I would rather spread out my Inscribe, so I would want Svetya's Decree over Ruin Sword since we already picked one. Want to make sure we get that Justice influence, so we pick up a Svetya's Decree here. Interesting pick between the Midnight Hunter and the Unseen Marksman. At this point, we seem to be getting some ways of producing Justice influence, so I was leaning heavier into the Unseen Marksman. That being said, Midnight Hunter is amazing with Unleash units since you generate multiple copies, gives you easy sacrifice fodder to kill your opponent's units. But we end up taking the cheaper Unseen Marksman in the hopes that we'll be able to splash it. Nothing for us here, unfortunately, so we end up just taking in Burden. This was actually somewhat difficult. Torgov's Wear is obviously great, but Mature Avirax is just everything we want. It's an evasive body, 4 costs helps our curve, and the maximum power helps us play more copies of our Unleash units. Last Light Refugee is double Justice influence, so you can't really splash it. We end up taking it anyways, just in case. And then we get a Starkiss Wings pretty late there. Pack 4, pick one. You see we're punished pretty bad for not ending up in Primal because the Carnivorous Terror is just an amazing rare. But we have a couple options of solid units in Happy Harvester and Core Repairman. We end up going with Happy Harvester. Majestic Skies would be wonderful if we were Elcian. That being said, we have an Insect Swarm here that's just the easiest pick over any other common in the set. Now we're getting another Insect Swarm here. Just an easy pickup. Once again, nothing else to say here. So we end up just picking up another Grumbo's Platoon. This was an interesting pick. We had a Seek Power here, which could help us splash the Justice. That being said, since we already had 3 Justice and Scribe cards, I thought that was enough given the difference in power between Seek Power and just another Grumbo's Platoon. That's going to be our 4th one. As we're wrapping up this draft, the Shadow cards, nothing interesting, so Gravitor Trainee is actually an okay card. The fact that we can discard a card and get a Sigil helps us make higher maximum power and play more Unleash units. This pack is an easy Shadowlands Bone Picker. The fact we're going to get a second copy is really amazing. This pack, nothing interesting, so we pick up the Smog Monster. Probably doesn't get played, but there's nothing else for us. We just take a Lucky Prospector. Nothing here, we just take a Midnight Goon. Last couple picks of the draft. Boy, was this a rough draft. You guys saw how much of a roller coaster this was. Really weird signals we were getting passed from the other player. And unfortunately, that is a part of draft. If the person passing you the cards, the packs, doesn't really know what they're doing, your deck will suffer for it. We barely made playables here. We do have some really strong things that can happen. The pull from duty on either Grumbo's Platoon or Insect Swarm is absolutely nuts, and we do have the Tenured Graviturgist. We have an Inseparable, we have 2 Shadowlands Bone Pickers, Toxic Wisp. There are several strong uncommons that we actually can utilize in this deck. At the end of the day, given the packs and how rough the draft was, I think we came out of it with a viable deck. I hope you guys enjoyed this flash draft, and I'll catch you on the channel for more Eternal Unleashed drafts. Peace!